everybody. Welcome. I'm out for a day walk. It strikes me and has long been part of my awareness that us moderns, many of us, most of the time. Of course, when we use generalizations like this, we're in danger, and I'm in danger at the moment, of making a mistake that I call taking the worst common denominator of some generalization over a continuum. And just to be clear, there are children, and there are prodigies, and there are people whose experience is nothing like what we expect or learn to expect after we are enlanguaged and enculturated with the conceptual maps of our time and place. And there's a tragedy here, which I've spoken of at length in many of my videos, that results from this problem. And the tragedy is that we're missing, or we've traded, most of our capacities of intelligence, awareness, relation, and faculties, abilities, for the incredibly impoverished catalog that we acquire from our cultures. In childhood, these seeds of possibility are still nascent in us. But not only do our cultures and languages inhibit them, in many cases they prohibit them. And there's a concept that I came up with during a long non-ordinary experience with a non-human intelligence that lasted, perhaps it's still lasting, but the primary phase of it was 9 months long. And this occurred for me in 2002. It's actually interesting that I made that mistake. I'm not even sure it's a mistake, since I've just had a relatively similar experience, and the aura of that experience is still with me, though the experience was a dream. And the concept, I use a word to point at this concept. The word is transentience. Now, some of you have heard me comment in my videos that the Earth and the biosphere, and of course the sun and the moon and time-space itself, are participating together in forms of activity and relation that moderns have no concepts for. And without these concepts, we are unlikely to be able to notice or participate in the actual strangeness of reality. And so too, perhaps, in forms of awareness and intelligence that we are inclined to ascribe to madness, visionary states, and psychedelic experience. As most of you know, I'm extremely cautious in my concerns about the common use of psychedelics to achieve non-ordinary experience. And the main reason that I'm concerned, though there are others, I'll mention them, I guess. The first is that there are many minds that their common structure is vulnerable, are vulnerable to catastrophic destabilization under the influence of psychedelics. And because we have, most of us, again, many of us sometimes, we have I lost the thread here because I'm excited. We have very little experience of non-ordinary consciousness. And certainly madness qualifies. Now, again, when we use this term madness, if I use it, we have to be very cautious of taking the worst common denominator, because it can certainly be said that many of the great prodigies of history were either catastrophically misunderstood or dismissed as insane. Not all of them have the capacity to reach into culture with their work, writing, creative activities, and acquire some degree of validation, or even transform the lexicons and catalogs of ideas and concepts with which we are familiar. Many people who were incredibly intelligent and produced staggering works of genius were not merely prodigies, they were also insane by all common, by most common definitions. Einstein is a good example. Lynn Margulis, Carl Sagan's wife and Dorian Sagan's mother, is another of them. And since the test for sanity is primarily that the ideas, concepts, models, and speculations, or theories, hypotheses, presented by someone are found within the present catalog of collective representations, anything that is presented or spoken or written that is not found within the current catalog is often dismissed by the mob, the vast generalized we, as insane. And that's a strange model of sanity. And when we think about insanity, once again we're faced with a topology or continuum in which there are mountains that are staggeringly insightful, and there are valleys or even crevices in which consciousness has effectively is somehow attacking its own root, producing decoherence and delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, voices, and so on. Now we would imagine perhaps, if we're being very mainstream in our thinking, that everyone who hears voices has gone mad. This is certainly not the case. And there are other forms of consciousness that don't involve vocalizations in the mind that would be likely to be dismissed as delusional. The problem is that the limitations imposed by our collective representations, the prohibitions, the inhibitions, the failure to nurture a broad array of faculties that are natural not just to human beings but to organisms in general, the exclusion of these faculties from the canon, if you will, the commonly validated propositions and rules and so on, turns out to be catastrophic for the possibilities of our lives and societies and intelligences. If we look and see what is included and what the ramifications or sequelae, the results, the repercussions of our common collective representations, we find very obviously that they're incapable of producing intelligent societies, and instead produce ideas, behaviors, and models of the world and life that are not merely directly false to facts available to our immediate experience. They turn out to be omnicidal, right? And this is a word that I invented to describe behaviors that attack and destroy pretty much everything, or just wreak death and destruction on Earth and in human societies and lives arbitrarily. But there is a frontier here for human awareness, thought, and intelligence, for human societies, that has long been, if not ignored, directly opposed. Many, if not most, children are aware in their childhood that the ways that adults think and use language are insane. Now, the children may not have the concept insanity, but they intuitively sense that something is horribly wrong with the bizarre courtroom of blaming, identity, propositions, syllogisms, and axioms that infest the minds of their parents. Now, while I'm going ahead and taking the worst common denominator here, I'm just going to apologize once for doing so that I don't have to keep doing that as I continue, with the recognition that the actual continuum contains examples of incredible intelligence, prodigy, genius, and something that resembles sanity in the sense that it rejects those aspects of the collective representations that make something resembling sanity impossible. So when we are children, the potential for wild, incredible experience and development of prodigy is desperate to find support, nurturance, and safety in the battlefield of ridiculous ideas that comprise the lion's share of our collective representations. And some children, perhaps nearly all children, are able to preserve some degree not merely of doubt and skepticism, but of direct opposition to these impediments. And they may or may not enact this awareness in acts of creativity, in new propositions, theories, and ideas, new ways of seeing, relating, and behaving as human beings on earth. We labor, all of us, under the staggering weight of the transmissions of the dominant forms of thought and knowledge that we inherit during the processes of enlanguaging and enculturation. Alfred Korzybski, I don't really agree with him that this is the primary difference in human beings between us and animals. He called this behavior time binding. And if I understood him somewhat, what he meant was this transmission of bizarre, often fatally flawed, lethally flawed, at least, lethal in the sense of forgetting, representations, models, thoughts, ideas, theories. At least for the past few thousand years, the humans have believed and acted as if, en masse, right? Individual humans are unique. They're not the same as when I take the worst common denominator over the continuum of the mass of humans. They have believed that essentially the world and perhaps the universe exists primarily for our promotion, benefit, propagation, dominance, and so on. And so there's a strange colloquial anthropocentrism, which is now beginning to transform into something even more dangerous, mechanocentrism. So we inherit this burden at birth, and few of us, it seems, particularly here where I live in the United States, are lucky enough to encounter wise peers, writings, and adults who can nurture the seeds of prodigy that are natural to all human beings. I've recently been reading a book probably written in the 60s or 70s by John Lilly. And Lilly was a prodigy and was extremely concerned with the plight of the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins, and also perhaps the sea mammals in general. He is the reason that we had the film Flipper and the TV show Flipper, and is also the origin of the tragic film with George C. Scott, Day of the Dolphin, in which a man similar to Lilly is effectively captured by the military in an effort to use dolphins as weapons of war to sink enemy ships. What I want to make clear here is that the mass of our species is not only overlooking or denying something that is fundamentally obvious. And there seems to be a purpose in this denial, and the purpose is related to the justification of lethally catastrophic behavior toward each other, intelligence itself, and the history and future of life on Earth. Compared to the other species that surround us, our species is incredibly young. And the idea of species is itself very confused, because it poses as distinct any organism which can be classified by certain physical features. In this, we have become delusional as a result of our propensity to catalog and categorize in ways that are false to facts and that imply or demand separations between organisms that, while they are not entirely false, lack insight to such a degree that should we continue to think in this way, we will become incapable of intelligent consideration of nearly anything. If we imagine a species that flips this over, we would see that their fundamental principle would be the principle of unity. Not the principle of distinction. One can imagine a species that, when counting the human hand, would count the palm first because it's the most important thing, the unifying body, of which the members are unique extensions. And this, I propose, is a model that leads us out of the dangerously confused category behavior that is most common in our people. None of the organisms of Earth exist in isolation. All of them intimately depend not merely on all the other organisms, but on the sun. To such a degree that we would be more intelligent to think of them as the products of the sun, time-space, the sun, the earth, the moon, the planets, the local space-time environment. They are all extensions of this in the same way that our fingers are extensions of our hands. But our minds are the same kind of extension. If there is anything resembling actual intelligence in humans, it is the extensional result of the nature of time-space itself. Though it is useful to entertain models where, as many believe, it's an accident. Yeah. That time-space needn't be intelligent or transcendent to produce minds and beings and so on. Now, Lilly was aware, from his long familiarity with cetaceans, that the dolphins are transentient. They are not merely sentient. There is an extra dimensionality that goes far beyond what we think of as sentient. And I guess the common definition of sentience, by the way, that word definition literally means de-infinitizing. He was aware that the dolphins, in their common behavior, relationships, activities, and so on, represented an intelligence inconceivable to the human collective representational models. They are not alone in this. They turn out to be one of the most accessible to humans with our strange impediments, intelligences on Earth. But the nature of the biosphere, I will argue, is fundamentally transcendent. And it's useful to notice that the common definition for sentience, when reduced to a clumsy deliverable, is something like self-aware. But again, imagine a species of beings who are actually intelligent, so that they first sense the unity of all forms of life fundamentally, and only secondarily are concerned with the concept or sense of individuality. It seems that for it's at least possible that for long periods of human history, the concepts I, me, and mine were not apparent in the explicit forms that are commonly on offer in our collective representations. But I will argue that not merely are the other organisms of Earth participating in forms of unity that are so astonishing that they would wreck nearly everything we know, lay waste to it, and establish there a form of relational, intuitional, and cognitive prodigy, or many forms, a symphony of prodigies, that are generally hinted at only in science fiction. Now, it's a strange thing that science fiction would be one of the libraries of ideas that could lead us out of the lethal labyrinth of our collective representations and into the possibility of participation in something that our species in general has as yet failed to imagine. But that is the nature of what we call nature. Nature uses unities to accomplish things that are literally impossible in our ordinary ways of thinking and modeling what's going on. And I will argue further that the idea of what's going on is fundamentally misfounded, because what's going on are beings, and beings aren't things. So we might rephrase that as who is going on here? Well, some of you have heard me argue that the earth is doing something, is being someone in time-space, and her activities and nature as unimaginable to modern humans as well as anything you can suppose to be difficult to imagine, and more. But fundamentally, the organisms here are engaged in producing an asset, or an array of assets, that we don't have any concepts for yet. Now, it's also clear that many indigenous peoples had deep and resounding awareness of many of the things that I am speaking of, and they were also extremely cautious about the game of representational knowledge. They knew it was dangerous. They knew it could lead to a kind of forgetting so painful that it could only be compared to death. And their languages and models of the animals and the living places preserve clear evidence of this. It seems also that in many cases they were, or in some cases still are today, masters of indirection. This might be thought of as a relatively feminine principle that is the opposite of declaration. They could suggest without declaring. thus leaving the manifold uncollapsed, whereas declaration collapses the manifold of possibilities into a deliverable. Indirection preserves the manifold's dimensionality and thus invites insight rather than curating knowledge. The sensing and communications activity of dolphins is profound beyond anything the moderns have been capable of considering. And though there are occasional sort of champions of the cetacean intelligence networks, they have largely failed to penetrate our catalogs of collective representations, so that even if moderns imagine that dolphins and whales are, quote, intelligent, unquote, mostly what is meant by that is something very trivial, which is the capacity to solve certain kinds of problems and the capacity for self-awareness. Right? Literally, the awareness of a separate self. But where in our lexicons will we find the complement of self-awareness, which turns out to be difficult to frame in English because the language itself is forged around a terribly misguided concept of what separate means. Many of the ancient languages, it appears, were fundamentally verbal, meaning flow and process and relationship oriented, rather than nounal, right? Now, David Brin, in his Uplift series books, proposes a future in which the humans are admitted to a collective of spacefaring intelligences, each of which has a known, quote, uplift parent, unquote. Meaning, another species that essentially lifts them from ordinary animalian cognition, this is ironic because, again, the intelligence of the relationships between the organisms on Earth renders the ideas of human intelligence absurdly trivial. Compared to the intelligences in mere bacteria, what we are doing resembles painting in shit with our faces and dancing around about the results. And it's primarily because we can make tools and we use representational language, that we think ourselves somehow above the organismal basis and symbiotic networks from which our minds and bodies arise moment to moment, without which we would perish instantaneously. And no part of our intelligence could rescue us from that problem. So part of what I'm trying to say here is that there's something much better, and it's directly available to us, than anything that the humans ordinarily think of as intelligence. And one of the pointer words I use for this is transentience. Right? It's absolutely clear to me that the dolphins are transentient, and I certainly don't mean this in any technological way. If we think of technologies as tool making and representational cognition. Cognition which makes representations of things and then confuses those representations with the things they point to and uses this process in an attempt to leverage domination. We've inherited a problem from Darwin. And the problem is the proposition that it's survival that matters. It's relatively easy to illustrate the problem with a reference to the disease we call cancer. Cancer is an example of cells in the body which could be said to depart from symbiotic relation with the network of cells that comprise the body, promoting the agenda of local survival over all other priorities. Cancer cells appear to be effectively eternal. They do not die of old age. They can be killed by misadventure. They are killed when the body that they exist in dies. But other than that, they'll simply go on, metastasizing endlessly. And as many of the people who study biology know, there's a woman whose last name is Lacks, L-A-C-K-S, I think. Perhaps her first name is Henrietta. And cancer cells from her body are found in oncology labs all over the world, even though she died, I believe, in the 1950s. What I'm hoping to make clear here is that at this very moment we are existing in a field on Earth of intelligences so profound that no modern human has been capable of suggesting their complexity, their profundity, their origin. Imagine a series of bubbles within bubbles. Imagine that there is something first outside the physical universe, which I will call origin, for lack of a better word. And it is this to which all religions effectively refer. And that within that bubble, there's a bubble called time-space. And within that bubble, there's our galaxy. And within that, our solar system. And within that, unity. These are orders of unities, not separate things. Each successive bubble is an expression of the supervening unity. And within that bubble of our solar system, we have the complex relationships between the sun, the planets, the local stellar context, the bubble sort of that the sun makes in interstellar space. And then within that bubble we have the Earth. And within that bubble we have the transcendent network of organisms, life itself. And within that bubble, the humans. Now, if you begin to think in this kind of way, you will see that unity is the fundamental principle, not separation. And what survival means can be destroyed by the idea that it applies to separate species or organisms. It will not help you a bit if your index finger survives, but your palm is gone, your wrist is gone, the body to which it connects is gone. You can see how ridiculous, in this analogy, the common way of thinking must be. Nearly all the other organisms on Earth are aware, whether or not they are consciously aware, of the imperative of preserving the unity, the relationships first, the symbiosis first. If this were not true, your body would attack itself as every cell attempted to survive at the expense of the unity. And cancer is precisely this kind of situation. And on Earth, the modern humans, as a species, are doing precisely this. And they're not really attempting to survive. They're attempting to exist in forms that are lethally misguided and effectively simply magnify what we think of as conveniences, right? They propagate things that are posed in thought as convenient. Nearly all of those things attack unity. They reject symbiosis in favor of the, quote, rights, unquote, of individuals. Rights to what? Rights to a kind of living death in societies so malignant that they pose a threat not merely to every human life, but to the history and future of life on Earth. This cannot be intelligence. We need to call it something else. And frankly, it seems to me to be a disease. The fact that a human being may survive is certainly not the most important feature of their life, right? Like, we're all aware that there are forms of survival so miserable that the fact that you're not yet dead is trivial compared to the incredible suffering that you and others who you love must undergo, and the bizarre spectacles and ramifications of representational culture are mind and soul deadening wherever they are not authentic. Now, to go back to the idea of species, our classification system, its root is a model of separation that must be wrong. I believe the Linnaean classification, although when carefully understood by relatively intelligent persons, the root of the Linnaean classification system does show a model where unity can be observed. But the system itself relies fundamentally on individuals. Imagine a different system that classified organisms according to their primary, secondary, tertiary relationships, and so on. An entirely different picture of the nature of life on Earth would emerge. The emphasis would be on symbiosis rather than separation and survival. And we might have a shot at something resembling intelligence in our collective representations of life on Earth and biology. We've got the whole thing backwards in such a way that we're trading the possibilities of astonishing faculties in consciousness, in cognition, in relationships and behaviors for something so trivial that were we aware that this was going on, we would never allow it to proceed for even one more minute, whoever we might be. There are alive today humans who deeply understand what I'm speaking about and exist almost covertly in our modern societies, in some cases. They are capable with their minds of touching not merely the intelligence of a tree, but something I will call the great world forest, which is the society of all trees, or even the society of all plants, or even the society of all organisms. And as a participant in those societies, they receive insight and gifts that are thought to be impossible by us moderns and our reliance on the strange catalogs we use to determine the separate identities of things and situations. The modern humans, as a mass, don't believe that they don't have the idea of transcentience. They think that things are either they can talk to you in words and demonstrate representational cognition, or they are not intelligent. And again, this definition of intelligence is like cutting off the legs of our own and then burning them up for some bizarre ritual that we ourselves don't even understand. The frontier for human beings is not new machines. It is not traveling into space. The frontier for us is the possibility of recovering our direct experience, knowledge, and understanding of the transcendent field that the biosphere naturally produces, probably as a mere side effect of whatever it is actually doing in time-space. There's another trope that's interesting here, which is, and I've mentioned it in a number of my recent recordings, which is that as bees are to flowers and honey, X is to living worlds and Y, the letter Y. And this shows that we are missing fundamental ideas about the nature of living worlds in time-space, primarily because of two problems. We think the Earth is separated from them by distance, and we seem to believe that the universe favors humans and is anthropocentric. This cannot be true. So the frontier before us is the recovery and discovery of our nature as transentient organisms on a world so swarming, right? Literally swarming with forms of intelligence and relation that we have as yet failed to either consider, believe, discover. Now, there are many people who, you will see a little bit of pushback in biology. You'll see bizarre headlines where this is a catastrophic mess. So the language that often introduces research, scientific research to us, is truly bizarre. We might see a headline like, "Science discovers that crows exhibit intelligent behavior and can solve problems," and so on. Yeah. So the humans set up some mechanical problems for crows. The crows clearly are capable of sophisticated mechanical thought. And so the humans decide, oh, maybe the crows have something resembling our intelligence. Except that what we call intelligence mostly isn't, right? The fact that the crows are capable of solving mechanical problems does imply something complex about their cognition. But all of the organisms solve problems. In fact, if we're looking, if we decide that problem solving is the fundamental principle that demonstrates intelligence, there's no organism that isn't doing that. The problem is that we don't recognize the modes of intelligence that aren't representational, right? That don't solve the mechanical problems that we place before them. Now, it appears that life on Earth depends fundamentally on the capacity of plants to solve a problem that requires quantum mechanical interactions. John Joe McFadden details this in one of his books, the older one, and perhaps the newer one, which I have not seen. I think he has a few books out. Plants have the capacity to leverage, I believe, if I remember correctly, a superposition. And there's another piece of research I'm aware of where, and I may get this slightly wrong, but the principle is the important thing here, where E. coli, okay, let me see if I can remember this. So in our present understanding of evolution, it should be impossible physically to produce a radical transformation of a genome to option or leverage an opportunity. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that there was some research that showed, rather forcefully, that colonies of E. coli placed under evolutionary stress could, in a single or maybe as few as 2 or 3 generations, produce gene changes that would allow them to digest cellulose when placed in a situation where their ordinary nourishment is absent. This implies not only that the E. coli are functionally intelligent, but that they have the capacity to undergo evolutionary leaps under situations of stress. If the definition of intelligence is transformed into supports the survival of all beings in all of time, or is capable of leveraging features of the molecular and quantum mechanical situations, or perhaps those two things together, right? You can see that the problem here is, what is the root, right? What is the root principle that the idea of intelligence emerges from? And if that root principle attacks the entire history and future of life on Earth for the sake of mechanical, quote, conveniences, unquote, which are lethal, then that's a pretty bizarre definition of intelligence, isn't it? Our lives as human beings are brief and often filled either with great privilege or great suffering, or both. But what they might be, if we could begin together to recover the faculties and nature of our organismal and symbiotic relationships, an entirely new universe would appear to us. A universe of unimaginable brilliance, prodigy. The opposite of the noise you may hear in the mic. As I was saying earlier, there are many organisms that humans can relate with directly that are profoundly transentient, yes, and will demonstrate this. They will demonstrate it with features of communication that we might, in our attempt to understand them, first think of as telepathic. But I'd like to argue that the idea of telepathy is backwards. The idea that minds can communicate directly without intervening technologies, such as spoken words, is the nature of minds. So we, thinking the opposite, that minds are separated in separate bodies, having been taught this, having had it hammered into us throughout our childhood and lives, we have to have this sort of conceptual prosthesis. Oh, that's telepathic. But before there was language, minds were communicating. It's fairly clear that organisms such as bacteria or cells in our bodies don't have they don't have brains, right? And we are inclined to think that brains equal the capacity for intelligence. This is not the case. The bacteria, having 0 brains, are capable of astonishing acts of symbiotic intelligence upon which the existence of those things we call brains and minds fundamentally depends. So we can see that everywhere in nature there's a situation at play that doesn't match our models at all, and in fact directly refutes them. I've come now to a little boat dock on the San Joaquin Delta that I used to catch fish at when I was a child. And I can hear the vocalizations of many birds. I can hear the voice of the entire history of life on Earth in those vocalizations. And I assure you that whatever we may think intelligence is some tiny and trivial subset of the intelligence in the field of music produced by these birds. Anyone who has a relationship with a dog or a cat and or a horse, or perhaps a rat or a rabbit, it turns out that there are some organisms whose form of intelligence is near enough to something that we would include in that category, that we are capable of recognizing that although they do not speak in language, they are aware. And their awareness is non-ordinary. It's not like ours. They don't see the world first through language and thinking. They see the world first through relation. And anyone who has been close with these animals is clearly aware that the animals have faculties that either we would call telepathic or at the very least non-ordinary. But what I am arguing is that the stuff we call telepathy preceded the stuff we call language. Before we had television, we had group dreaming. Before we had radio, we had minds communicating at a distance. Before we had the internet, we had its supralog in the symbiotic networks of life on Earth. More than 30 years ago, having had the opportunity to observe octopuses in films, it was blatantly obvious to me that these creatures are profoundly intelligent. Most of them have, actually, I think I got it right the first time. These creatures are intelligence. See, this is the problem. This is the problem. The organismal networks of Earth are intelligence of a kind the humans have not yet recognized. And I believe that the recognition of those intelligences and the participation in their relationships is the fundamental privilege of human beings, and that is the privilege that is being destroyed, ignored, subverted, converted to product and convenience and objects. When minds touch, the nature of the great unity comes to life in those minds. It is a reunion of a kind that makes our hopes of heavens and things like this absurd in comparison. It radically exceeds all ideas. You know, I commonly sing the praises of specific organisms, the bees particularly, the octopi and cephalopods, the cetaceans, the equines, the canines, the felines, the rodents. I have had experiences with mice that are so profound, wild mice, that they make what the humans are doing look silly in comparison because they require no prosthesis like representational thought or language. The fundamental nature of intelligence is not representational, it's relational. Of all the insects that I've encountered, all of them are intelligent and profoundly intelligent. And many of them, particularly creatures that we would call synanthropic, meaning effectively they prosper in the proximity to humans. These creatures have naturally evolved the capacity to communicate and relate with humans on a transentient basis. But of all of them, one stands out to me personally, and I have no direct experience of octopuses or dolphins, whales. But the insect that we call the praying mantis is almost a concentrated example of the nature of transentience in time-space. And when I said earlier that nearly all of the organisms on Earth are much older than humans, I didn't mean older in linear time. It's very important for us to be capable of thinking in evolutionary time. Because in evolutionary time, if you have a organism, or what we call a species, whose numbers on Earth over time are staggering, then you can see that the idea of being ancient is explosively profound in the case of such organisms. Ants, bees, and wasps produce probably trillions of organisms per year. So if life on Earth, let's say I don't know when these creatures appeared in the fossil record, but let's say they're, wild guess here, 800 million years old in linear time, right? You have to multiply that by the number of reproductions that occurred. So some of these creatures in evolutionary time are vastly older than the universe. They're much older than 14.3 billion years. They're vastly older than the Earth, right? Which I guess is about 4.5 billion years old. Excuse me, did I get that right? 3.5 billion years. I can't remember whether it's billion or million. You can look it up if you wish. But my point is that the intelligence, over that scale of evolutionary time, what you get are physical and relational intelligences that are so profound that they might produce cognitive intelligences like ours as a side effect of their activity. The mantises, however, are extremely unique in my experience. There's no creature... I mean, all of the ambush predators are somewhat similar. Snakes, spiders, perhaps some scorpions, cats, right? These creatures are like the expression of an aspect of transentience in time-space. They are the embodied expression of this aspect. Praying mantises have been synanthropic for billions of generations. And they are capable of staggeringly deep relation with human beings. Those of us who are so inclined, and I've had this inclination since childhood, thankfully, will find in relation with these organisms a doorway beyond everything that we think of as intelligence, a living door to the anciently conserved families of awareness, sensing, perception, and relation in time-space. And I say that these families comprise a unity, a single family, and that the preservation and discovery and relation with and as members of this family is the true frontier for us beleaguered humans. Our models of the universe and time-space, circa 2022, are mostly mechanical. Physics and quantum physics are viewed presently as mechanisms, right? The interactions of separable features that we can catalog, test, measure in some degree, and so on. But I think something very astonishing might occur in the near-term future. The discovery of the structure called the amplituahedron, whose primary proponent, I think, I may have his name wrong, is Arkani Hamed, seems likely to present a door that could lead us beyond the mechanical categorization of these phenomena into something that might directly introduce us to the nature not merely of the universe, but of the great family of intelligences and minds that dwell therein. We think of the amplituahedron, actually, I'm not sure how to think of it, but it is generally talked about with common people as a kind of hypergeometric structure. I'm reminded of situations where humans have encountered situations and perhaps beings that we conceive of as beings from another world or perhaps another dimension. Of course, I'm speaking here of what we call aliens. But again, I think we've got the concept backward. Having alienated ourselves from the great unity of life and intelligence that time-space must be more than, having failed to even acquire the concept of transentience, except perhaps in some bizarre and confused computational idea, we've got the wrong idea about what the universe is and is doing and who it is being. And I recall, I've studied UFOs since I was a child, long before it became kind of a popular cult. And I was always interested in anomalies because they show that there are holes in the collective representations of our time. And those holes often turn out to be doorways to new understandings and insights. But I remember hearing that there is a report of a situation in Africa where something that the humans categorize as a spaceship, or perhaps a transdimensional vehicle, landed in a schoolyard, and beings emerged from the vehicle, and they, quote, spoke, unquote, with groups of children. And one of the things that it is reported, if I remember correctly, hang on a moment, I've got a car here that is blaring music. In speaking with the children, they apparently explained to them, and I doubt they were speaking the language the children spoke. Nearly always in these reports, the form of communication is mind to mind. But they told the children that the humans were doing something very dangerous. And this is a common report. They also told them that they have the wrong idea about what space is. And since Einstein, we've unified space and time, though people still think when they look up at the sky they're seeing space, I don't think that's what's up there. To me, it's a transentient field that produces minds like ours as a natural result of who it is being. Now, of course, religions may pose that, may present the proposition that there are non-physical intelligences, gods, angels, devas, jinn, so on. And it's my direct experience that there are beings of this nature, but it's not clear what their what their composition actually is. It certainly is the opposite of the thing that just passed me, that I had to raise my voice just to be heard above, in my own ears. Right? It appears to me that there are forms of intelligence that not merely participate in the field of organismal intelligence on Earth, but that the field of organismal intelligence on Earth is an organ of these beings. Unless this seem like wild speculation, there are millions of reports of experiences of this, of encounters with it. Whatever the UFOs that actually land and interact in some way with humans, whatever the category of phenomenon that is, I think we don't have this category in our lexicons. While it may, in some cases, be something that resembles creatures from another world or another dimension, I think it's a phenomenon that's transcendental to our categories. And most of the world, the organisms and reality is like this. If we start here, if this is our founding principle, the unity of minds across time-space, the opposite of physical distance applies. There are situations in which, contrary to our mechanical understandings of communication, in bold opposition to them, physical distance equals greater intimacy. We don't have this idea primarily because we think signals must travel in a mechanical fashion. Assets must be transmitted in a mechanical fashion, subject fundamentally to the mechanical speed of transport and or the speed of light. If our species survives much longer, I think we will discover two things. What light is doing isn't travel, and there's a reference frame, or some reference frames, in which distance is closeness. I know, as is almost always the case, that as soon as I decide to end my recording, 5 or 10 or 15 things will arise in my mind that I desperately want to include. But I think for the sake of some degree of brevity, I will leave off here. I'm very grateful to have this chance to learn together and to try to remember the actual nature of our human potential, our way of being, and the possibilities for reunion with each other and the great family, the communion that arises from the truth of unity over distance. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again sometime very soon.